So we'll move to the next panel. I would like to invite my colleague, Julia Fanti, to introduce the panelists. Julia?
Thank you so much, Hassan. Could we get the slide with the panelists' photos? So we're delighted to introduce the second panel of the day, which is going to be on data sovereignty, data locality, and data sharing in Africa. Our first panelist is Mr. Mohamed Mubashir Massaquoi, who's the Director General of the National Civil Registration Authority of Sierra Leone. Mr. Massaquoi, welcome to the stage. Our second panelist is Mr. Wanilo Medegan, who's the Director General of the National Agency of Security for Information Systems in Benin. Mr. Medegan, welcome. Our third panelist is Ms. Arlette Rakazina, who's the General Manager for Cybersecurity and Innovation at the Rwanda Utilities Regulatory Authority. Welcome. And our fourth panelist is Mr. Fidelis Suedi, who's a Senior Technical Advisor on Digital Health at the Clinton Health Access Initiative. Mr. Suedi, welcome. All right, thank you all so much for joining us. I'd like to start by having each of you please briefly address the audience and tell us a little bit about in what context have you thought about data sovereignty, data locality, and data sharing. Mr. Massaquoi. And the microphones, there's a gray button that you can push to speak at the bottom. Yeah, this one.
Thank you very much, and good morning all. Well, in our context in Sierra Leone, we have moved so much in a way that we have been able to consolidate, integrate data covering all critical vital events occurring in our lives in Sierra Leone to be able to account for the population, and those vital events are properly recorded and reported on as may be needed. And before then, it was fragmented, where various institutions were involved in harvesting the data. And we realized as a government and as partners involved in the process that was causing some of duplication and waste of resources. And then as partners or stakeholders involved in that process, we've had to consolidate the data and integrating it, and then with the possibility of legal provision for sharing the data as may be needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Medegan?
Thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. Concerning the ANSI in Benin, actually we adopted in 2020 a national cybersecurity strategy, and that strategy is developed around 5 axes. But all these axes contribute in the enhancement of the cybersecurity, fighting cybercrime, cooperation, the skills, and awareness. And protection of personal data is at the center of that strategy, that national strategy. This is where we come into contact with data sovereignty, data localization, around everything that involves collecting public data and exploiting them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Medegan. Ms. Rakazina?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As you said, I'm from the Utilities Regulatory Authority here in Rwanda, and it's a multi-sector regulator. We regulate telecommunication, we regulate transport, electricity, and water. So the department I'm heading, the Cybersecurity and Innovation Department, was established to accommodate the ever-growing ICT sector. And we have mainly 3 functions: cybersecurity, first the innovation part. So we sort of play the role of support to the other departments, the traditional departments, in terms of new technologies, AI, IoT, so whatever is emerging and new technologies. And we also are responsible for cybersecurity, so we make sure those ICT solutions are secure, and trustable by the end users. The third function is data analytics. So as a regulator with all those sectors we are regulating, we have a lot of data coming to us. So the department is in charge of ensuring that the data is correctly captured and analyzed to allow data-driven decision making. So those three functions, basically on a daily basis, because of those three functions, we deal with data sovereignty, data locality, and data sharing. Yeah, from the functions we perform within.
Thank you so much. Mr. Suedi.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. So I come from Malawi, and mainly I've been supporting the Ministry of Health around building data structures, but also ensuring that there's responsible data use. And apart from the support towards health data, I've also been supporting responsible data use around child protection systems. So my experiences really will be shared around how well can the government side work with the technology vendors to ensure that there's responsible data use. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And can I follow up on that? In what role were you supporting the government in their efforts?
Right. So working as a technical advisor to on digital health to the Ministry of Health, there's been so many support areas that I've provided to the ministry around how can we formulate policies that will ensure that when partners want to access data, what's the best approach that they need to take to access the data? And then once they have that data, how do you ensure that there's responsible data use? I remember one of the speakers spoke about trust. One of the things that we look at is how do we strengthen the trust between the partners as well as the Ministry of Health to ensure that the data that is shared is used in a responsible manner and also with respect to privacy and security concerns.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have a great mix of technologists and regulators on the panel. So I look forward to seeing how those opinions differ. So one of the key components of digital public goods includes open AI models and open data sets, which implies that these data sets and models should be shared across national borders. How does this relate to recent requirements and pushes towards keeping data local and limiting the amount of user data that gets transmitted across boundaries? Can I start with you, Mr. Masakwai?
Well, it's to me, it guarantees the process of sharing data in a way that you are guided as to who you share information with, what sort of information to share, and how guarantee is the security of the data you share, in the sense that it doesn't cause threat, or it doesn't become a problem for you, the recipient, and also the source of the data, in a sense that your various form of data. And surely you will agree with me that, or people will agree with me that, in as much as we want openness in sharing information on our respective population, but also we have to be mindful of the fact that when you have things loose, open, there's a risk. It poses some risk because there is no control. But at the same time, you want to make sure that as you open the process, then you have a means of controlling that process so that it doesn't waste, it doesn't cause trouble, etc., etc. Now, personal information like health records, for instance, it can be open to authorized users and authorized physicians, for instance, with the consent of the patient. You can't say because it's open source and people must have access to your personal health information. It's a risk to your privacy and your threat to your very survival. And therefore, that's what I said, that there is need, in as much as we say we share, there has to be open process of sharing data, but we must also be guided in a way that we regulate it so that it is not abused and it doesn't cause any threat to our existence. Security data, for instance, yes, it can be shared in an authorized manner, in a way that it doesn't become a security threat to the very survivor of the people that you claim to be protecting. Otherwise, if you let it loose like that, you cannot control your people. You cannot control it, and you will face a risk of jeopardizing their existence. Some other form of data can be shared, and to be able to account for events that occur, for instance, for communication purposes. Also, you can, to be able to put a halt to pranks and abuse of communication in a way that communication is accounted for. Yes, you can share that, again, through the system that is regulated so that it doesn't cause a problem for the users and as well as everyone that is involved in the process. So whilst I agree, but there is need for open source data, where data is accessed as and when needed. But I also want to say that what guarantees that openness is when there is a system in place that controls or checkmates abuse or misuse, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Um, Ms. Rakwazina, would you like to react to that?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's obvious that whenever if you are dealing with data restriction, especially on data locality, is going to bring limitations in terms of, skilled people, especially for countries that are yet to build their data capability at the fullest. So there will be a limitation in terms of skills. For example, skilled people to access and analyze your data. There will be limitations in terms of aggregating data from different locations, or in terms of infrastructure cost that now is, not shared. But we really believe there are, solutions to that. And that could be data sharing frameworks between, different locations, cross-border data sharing frameworks. And for this, we need to see, as my colleague was saying, what are the data we need to share? Do you really we need to be specific in terms of what kind of data needs to go to cross the border, and create a framework that will ease that data sharing, but limiting to a certain specific data, maybe even in time. Another thing that we actually doing as regulators is to harmonize the regulations around data, and when harmonized, either within the region or even we try to benchmark even on other continents, it becomes easier to consider whoever is accessing our data from abroad, or whoever wants to take data abroad, if we know we are, for example, harmonized with regulations in Europe or in our neighboring countries. Yep.
That makes a lot of sense. I think there's also an interesting discussion to be had about data use. So once it's been shared, what can it be used for? So we're seeing a trend of large AI models being trained on data that's scraped from anywhere they can find it. It's a really challenging problem to deal with. Mr. Medigan, what do you think about is there a tension between having open AI models and open data and efforts to keep control of data sets internally within a country?
The short answer is yes, because regulation is everywhere. Countries are doing great jobs regulating data and protecting personal data. If you look on the continent, you have the Convention of African Union, Convention of Malabo, that protects the personal data. At a national level, we have the digital law in Benin. We have, for the government asset, cybersecurity policy. For the critical infrastructure, we have a protection policy. And in each of these regulations, we have the data locality principle that is in the center. But there is some limits to that too, because it takes some, as Madame Arlette said, it takes some data capabilities. You have to be able to store all these data. You need to have some data centers that can hold all the data. And as many of our countries are still building this capacity, this is not always possible. So in this regulation, we put a special case where we have to analyze the need to store data outside of the country. And we, as a National Cybersecurity Agency, with the Authority of Data Protection, we analyze the request, and if the data is not too critical, or if the place that it will be stored meet certain conditions, we can allow it and monitor it when it's outside. So I think that when the regulation is well done, keeping these challenges and opportunities in mind when they are written, I think the limit is less strong.
That's very interesting. And when you do outsource these kind of data sets to other data centers in other countries, what kind of protections are typically in place, and how much auditing transparency do you have?
Sure. First of all, what we ask is the geographical localization of the data centers. If you go to a provider, a cloud service provider, he has many data centers in the world. Maybe you can choose, in our law, we can't choose to store data in a country that have a less protection for the data than our own country. So typically we prefer Europe, for example, than USA, because there is more protection for our data there. After, you have, on the cybersecurity level, you have a certain number of certification that the cloud service provider can show to assure you that a certain number of controls are in place. And what is really important is its capability to give you auditability. So if the provider gives you all these possibilities, you can go and be more happy with stored data there.
That makes a lot of sense. I would also rather store my data in Europe than in the United States. Mr. Suedi, what's your thoughts on the tension between open data, calls for open data, and requirements for data sovereignty and data locality?
Yeah, thanks very much. So first of all, the different governments will have their own policies around where the data is stored. And for the case of Malawi, there's a system that the data has to be stored locally. Suffice to say, we know that data is borderless. You can access it just by a click of a button from anywhere else. So what needs to happen is to really have strong governance structures around data privacy and data sharing. And also, if it's an issue of do we store it in the cloud or we store it physically on a physical server in the country, I think we have now options where internet service providers are also bringing in local hosting cloud-based services in country. So that's one way that governments can also ensure that the data is stored in a better infrastructure that can respond to growth in data needs. But I think to build very mature and good data models, you require almost real-time data, and you can actually benefit from data sets from other countries too. So I think it's a give and take situation. We saw, like for COVID response, there were some data sets that were used to build models in other countries, and taking that data to train your models in country is also a way that the governments can benefit. But at the end of the day, I think the government has to really find a balance between security and privacy versus how much will that data benefit the whole population if it's shared. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, in the academic world, we're technologists. We spend a lot of time thinking about technologies that can potentially be used to resolve some of these tensions. Things like federated learning, encrypted computation, synthetic data sharing. And I'm wondering if any of you have come across some of these technologies in your domain, and if you feel that these technologies have the potential to mitigate some of these concerns or some of these issues that have been brought up. Why don't we start with Mr. Medigan?
I think these kind of technology are the main key solution to this issue. For example, we used a lot of open source to accelerate our cybersecurity initiatives. When we were in creation as a national cybersecurity agency, we didn't have a lot of budget to start, so we did a lot of things with open source, and it was a great accelerator to operationalize our national cert. We built it on open source first, and for the courts, this allow us to build a lot of skills. When you use open source to start things, your teams are really gather a lot of skills doing that, and a lot of savings too. But in our domain of cybersecurity, information sharing is key. Information sharing is key with the others, with other countries that have the same attacks than you. I can take example of Burkina Faso that is in the room. The same attacks come in the Benin cyberspace than in the Burkina cyberspace. So an example of data sharing we did is to put in place some honeypots to collect the attacks coming toward us, and we put them in a threat intelligence sharing platform that we call a MISP. And we share it with other countries. Now we are trying to open it to all the ECOWAS countries, so everyone can benefit of what we have already treated as a threat. So the answer can be more precise on the other side, and vice versa. We can use what they also put in the platform. So this remind me what you call synthetic data, because it's not actually real data, even if it's real attacks data. And you see, if I take example of health data, we, in our regulation, we insist that these data are anonymized and with tokenization, so you can't, if you compromise the database, you can't directly make a link with the person. So such data can easily be used. So technology like that, paradigm like that of data can be solutions to data sharing.
Very interesting. These are topics that we work actively on in Scilab Africa and in CMU more generally. Ms. Rakwazina, would you like to comment?
Thank you very much. We as a multi-sector regulator, we actually our data, we need to be careful around privacy, but also around competition, because the data is actually from the utilities we regulate, and some of them are competing on a market. So if we are not careful, we tend to, I mean, there is already that risk of, having a big appetite for data and collecting a bit too much, something you need and something you don't need, and that actually increase the security concern. So what we do is to try and pull what we need, and we try first to, if, for example, if we are looking at transactional data, either on electricity purchase or transport, probably the conclusion you want to draw is around, which route I'm going to put when it's transport. So I probably don't need personal data like names or telephone number. So we tried first to have the data encrypted from the source, have the data coming to us without any personal data. But if it happens that they can't separate from the source, from the regulator, from the utilities, then we normally try to use encryption to make sure there is no personal data shared. We have quite some interest in AI. It's something we really look after, and federated learning is something we might not consider in the future. But for now, we focus on encrypting as much as we can, and we work with utilities to make sure it happens correctly.
That's very interesting. We'd love to chat more afterwards. Mr. Suedi, what do you think?
Thanks very much. So I think I want to approach it from an angle where we are talking about low-income countries. Yes, federated learning, encryption are things that can actually facilitate, can actually cut down issues of privacy and confidentiality. But when you look at low-income countries, you require robust connectivity, good bandwidth, and also you require strong computing power to enable the nodes to exchange data and talk to each other. So I think, yes, this is a solution that can support responsible data sharing and data exchange, but at the same time, there's that need for capacity building, not only in terms of putting the technology infrastructure, but also the technical know-how, having the right people who can facilitate that. So, for instance, in my country, artificial intelligence is still something that we're just beginning to grapple with. And for us to take advantage of these technologies, we require such kind of expertise as well as infrastructure. So I just wanted to point out that there's that element as well. But yes, it is one way that we can exchange data.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. I think that's something that we really overlook a lot in the technical community when we explore these technologies. Mr. Masakwai, would you like to comment on whether these technologies can help overcome some of these data sharing challenges?
Well, it does. In a case, for instance, let's say we have their technology use, but you know very well that you can't rely on technology entirely. It can fail as well, and so therefore, the need to have a very strong capacity building, to have people with the right skills and competencies to manage or respond to the evolution of technologies is very critical in our quest to have this open source system. And the reason for that is that you don't want to find yourself in a situation where, for lack of competencies or lack of skills in managing the technologies that you use or you introduce, you have a breakdown where your system collapses. And I remember recently we had some challenges and with our infrastructure. Because we use Dell technology and we did not have Dell engineers in Sierra Leone or even the neighboring countries, we had to source Dell engineers from Nigeria and UK to quickly run to Freetown to help fix the problem. So let us see if you had people with the right competencies. That could have been done without any alarm. But our system halted for some days, for some time, until we had the intervention of the Dell people from Nigeria and the UK. And that's very much critical as we talk about technology and in supporting or alongside the open source system, that you must have people trained continually in the management and operations of the technology. Otherwise, the very essence or intent of having open source system will be defeated, and maybe you are likely to start all over again. Haven't had so much investment done in the process. So invest in the system comprehensively, get the right technology, get the right people trained, skilled to manage the technology, and prepare them to face the dynamism of technology. Once you do that, we are likely to mitigate and accidents of technology collapse. Thank you.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm noting a lot of connections to the first panel about how it's not enough to develop technologies that are secure. What really matters is how you implement it in the field. So I'd like to take this opportunity to ask if any of the audience members would like to comment on the panel so far. Hassan.
Thanks. And this is great. I would like to bring actually the infrastructure issue. I found that while in Manilo, you mentioned it. When we are talking about hosting locally and even hosting in a country where we trust, we need also to look at the communication, how it works. So we know that data transit around the world. And wherever they go, well, we can make a copy and use it. So when we think of local of data, I think that we have to keep in mind that we're in a logical world. We are not in a physical world. And that has some implications. So, and what it requires for us as countries is to make sure that we have the infrastructure. You mentioned it. You mentioned the data centers, but also the communication systems to access those data centers. Because if we can't, then it's going to take forever to get the data in or out, and the purpose will be missed. So I think that as we are thinking of keeping data local, sovereignty of data, we have to think the infrastructure that is needed to enable it. And that I think that is something that we are missing actually in the continent, but in the discussions in general. That's the contribution I wanted to make, Julia.
Great points, Hassan. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Nathaniel from Sierra Leone. This question is been to Mr. Medigan. You made mention of hosting services being provided outside your country, maybe let's say in Europe. How do you deal with natural or socio-political catastrophes? For instance, let's say in Europe or elsewhere, where they store your data, and there are challenges of maybe these natural socio-political issues. How do you access, or maybe the country is been locked that you cannot have access to it? That's one. And how do you deal with data authentication and data authorization in your system? Thank you very much.
Maybe I will ask to ask again the second question. I didn't get it very well, but I will answer the first answer first. Actually, the news showed us that you don't. This is kind of catastrophe, as you said, and we are like powerless in front of it. When the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began, we saw some customer of some databases, cloud service provider, that have been locked out of their data. They were given few days to collect it back, and the service was shut down for them. When this happened, what can you do? There is no contract that can cover you for that. Maybe you can sue them after, but the worst is already done. So this is why sovereignty first is to be your own master concerning there's questions. And you actually one thing that can help you is to have replication. Actually, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. So even if the production of your service is outside because of the computation power and stuff, you still can have replication, backups, or disaster recovery on site. It will take less resources to build, but it offers you a certain assurance to be able to continue your activity. So this is one key control. And the second question, please.
I was actually, when you make mention of data anonymization,
Okay.
so maybe I would have loved to hear more about the authentication aspect and how do you authenticate that this is the right person and how do you authorize issuing out that data to that individual? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, concerning what we share, it's about trust, as it has been said on the first panel. It's about trust, trusted sources. The system we built to share threat intelligence is not open to everyone. It's country per country that there is adhesion, country per country. So we know exactly who is sending us data. This is not technological authentication, but it's about human trusting humans first. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks to the audience for the interesting questions. So in the last few minutes, I'd like to ask each of you to comment on how should we balance the tension between regulation and innovation to help encourage new data sharing practices while doing so responsibly. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Masakwai.
Regulation. Well, it's a matter of having the process extensively consultative, where you have every key stakeholder involved in the process. And then once you do that, then you'll be able to ensure ownership of decisions taken in terms of regulating the whatever initiative you want to undertake. And that has to be guided by the various interventions from various, for instance, various countries that will be involved in the data sharing process, what the regulations of those individual countries say, and then who are those that will be involved in the process of putting in place some measures that will guide the process. Like he mentioned, when you talk about data sharing, and he mentioned the issue of Europe, have we at any point in time had time to look at how data is harvested, stored, and shared in Europe, to which extent it's shared? And when you know that, you compare that to some other continents and countries generally, then you will be able now to decide clearly as to how you carve your own path in terms of regulating data sharing model. Otherwise, I'm not sure you will go anywhere in the process.
Thank you. How about Mr. Suedi? How should technologists and regulators work together to enable new data sharing practices?
Yeah, so I think the regulators, particularly from the government side, they will usually have huge data sets, and those data sets can actually benefit the technologists. So it is very important that there has to be clear policies and standards in terms of how people can innovate around the data that's shared. And this shall call for continuous engagement between the government and the technologists as well as researchers to facilitate issues around security and privacy concerns, so that everyone is aware and works with the data in a more responsible manner. And I think this builds on the issue of trust. So the different stakeholders need to make sure that they are abiding to a common set of rules in as far as data sharing is concerned. And this is the role of regulators to have strong governance structures that guides the process.
Thank you so much. We're just about out of time, but I'd like to hear from our last two panelists. Ms. Rakazina.
Yeah, thank you very much. On the question whether, I think the first panel touched on it, whether regulations should come before innovation. Our experience as regulators is that innovators will always often outpace us. So our approach is to have to be agile in our regulations and move away from one size fits all and rather segment depending on who's on the market, especially in the ICT domain. We have people with service providers with different sizes, let me say it that way. So the standards we put for some people, for some big players, is going to be different for small players. We try to, instead of giving licenses, we try to consider non-objections for small players. We try to consider sandboxing, and within those segments, obviously the data sharing requirements is going to be different, coming from heavy ones to lighter ones, depending on the size of the player.
That makes a lot of sense. Mr. Medigan.
My co-panelist said the most important things, but if I want to add something is that policymakers really have to work with technologists in order to build some standards, sector by sector, type of data by type of data, to enable data sharing within some precise framework that take in account all the innovations for today and tomorrow.
Thank you. And I'd like to wrap up with a comment from the Honorable Minister.
Thank you. I'll just be very brief. A couple of things I wanted to leave as reflections, because I will not pretend that I have the answers to most of the questions that have been asked, but perhaps also to pick on what Ahlet mentioned around agility. Again, even really responding to the question around how do you create the link between regulation and innovation? And I think a couple of speakers earlier spoke to the fact that, in the world that we live in today, innovations are more fast. The pace at which you have innovations coming to the market is nowhere close to the ability to create regulations and policies that are conducive enough for these products and innovations to go to the market. And so what oftentimes you see is that you have so many innovations and there's just lack of regulation or policies to support that. And that shouldn't be a bad thing. I think that's why you're seeing so many bodies that are being created where you have most of the regulators and policymakers that are at the heart of where innovation is happening, because they need to know what is coming up in the next 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years, and how do we start to prepare for that. Because truth be told, you can't regulate what you don't know. But also, how do you can't also leave it very open-ended where you're not regulating anything, but how do you create frameworks through which you still allow many of these products and innovations to get to the market as soon as possible, but in a controlled environment. I think Ahlet mentioned that sandboxing ideas, we've talked about collaboration that has to happen, the conversations that have to happen many often. Even to give you a very specific example for Rwanda, when we started to pilot the use of drones to deliver medical products, we didn't have any regulation. Neither did any country in the world have a regulation around how you use drones for logistics purposes. So we could have chosen to wait and see for someone else to come up with a set of regulations, whether they were contextualized or not to our particular circumstances. But what we chose is going with what we call performance-based regulations, where we say we may not understand all the risks involved with using drones to deliver medical products or to perform any logistical service, but let's sit together and have a conversation on what are those risks that we all know or we could think of, and how do we create a solution that responds to those risks in a way that doesn't stop us from, testing this proof of concept, and then we can use that proof of concept or that pilot to even fine-tune the regulations that we have in place. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to see in terms of of an example happening in the different fields when it comes to all of these emerging technologies. And then finally, even as we think about data sovereignty, locality, and data sharing, I remember a year ago when we were really putting together our data protection and privacy law, the biggest question for us was, how do we provide measures that are protective enough not to inhibit innovation? That balance was a very difficult one, because it's easy to say you want to balance between innovation and protection and privacy. But at the same time, what we had to do is to say, okay, let's go article by article and figure out which of these articles seem to be confusing or more biased to protection versus innovation, or vice versa. And then let's figure out what could be a middle ground. And one of them that came out very strongly was around the requirement for localization of data. And we had had that for a while in Rwanda, and we had had clear examples where you have banks, multinational companies that are working in different jurisdictions, where if every country is requiring them to localize, to store their data in country, then what we are doing without knowing is that we are taking away the ability to create new innovations that will leverage all these data sets combined. But also you're creating, in terms of doing business, you're creating so many red tapes, because the cost of setting up a bank in every country or any other business that is multinational in nature is going to be so high, because all of us are requiring them to store data in country. And so the question had to be, what is it exactly that we are worried about? If it's access, like most of you have shared, we need to be able to own and access our data as and when we need. How do we solve for that without a requirement to localize it in country? And so we came up with a concept of whitelisting, where we said, if we have a set of data protection and privacy regulations, which other countries have something comparable to what we have? And so when you come as a company and you want to host your data in Estonia, my job as a data protection officer is to understand what kind of measures do they have in place, and do they match what Rwanda has? And if the answer is yes, then I'll be comfortable for you to store the data there. Obviously, there's an extra step that now has to happen in terms, I think there was an example that was given around shutdowns that happen with data. How do you address that without mandating localizing data? Perhaps it's even those bilateral agreements that we sign as countries, where we know if we go in terms of data sharing, localization, if we're going to open up for our entrepreneurs and innovators and businesses to host in each country, what are the rules of engagement around that, so that there's no, and so I think every day, even in terms of agility as policymakers and regulators, I think we shouldn't create a problem, solve a problem by creating one. It's really to say, what is the other alternative of unlocking innovation, but at the same time opening up, because today we're talking about open data, open APIs, but how do you do that if everyone wants to keep their own data, if there's a lot of value in having trillions of data sets together, and especially now that we're going through the health crisis. I mean, if you're going to think about collecting all of this data and using it for medical purposes or even drug experimentation, how do you do that if everyone doesn't want you to take away their data from their own jurisdiction? And so these are things that at the policy level and regulation we need to think about and figure out what are the alternatives to solving for the concerns and risks we have than mandating that data must be stored within a country.
Thank you so much for the great comments. These really interesting perspective. And thank you to all of the panelists. Let's please give them a hand of applause. Okay.